Hello, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Avery Irons, and I am the Youth Justice Institute's Associate for Training and Technical Assistance. On behalf of the YJI, I'm happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar. Thank you for joining us today in this virtual space and for making time to learn about research into youth justice issues. Please feel free to introduce yourselves into the chat. Our gratitude also goes to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. I'd also like to extend a special hello to Dr. Adam Fine, who is in our virtual audience today. Adam presented a wonderful Lunch and Learn webinar on probation and families a couple months ago, and we learned so much from him. Thanks for coming back, Adam. I'd also like to do a quick welcome to three new members of the YJI team, Dr. Tori Kanoki, who is the YJI's new research associate, Tani Cruz, and Megan Willows, the new graduate research assistants. Today, it is our pleasure to host Lael Chester. Like all of you, I'm very much looking forward to our presentation on justice system reforms for emerging adults. It's wonderful to have you, Lael. Thank you. And with that, I will pass the baton to Brian Rainey. Brian, the cyber floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Avery. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Brian Rainey, and I'm a research fellow at the YJI. So the goals of this webinar series are to, 1, act as a source for cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues, 2, to provide this information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and 3, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore these issues. I have one housekeeping item today. For those of us who would like to view a transcript of today's festivities, we'll be providing a live transcription of the presentation. So just follow the link that is being put in the chat right now, and you'll be able to access that live transcription. And so our presenter today is Lael Chester. So Lael is the director of the Emerging Adult Justice Project at the Columbia University Justice Lab, a graduate of Barnard College and Harvard Law School. She worked as the Albert Martin Sachs Clinical Fellow at the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard, and then was an assistant attorney general in the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. So for 12 years, she served as executive director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice, a statewide nonprofit dedicated to improving the juvenile justice system. Lael led the successful Justice for Kids campaign, ending the practice in Massachusetts of automatically prosecuting and sentencing all 17-year-olds as adults, regardless of the severity of the offense. As a research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's program in criminal justice policy and management, Lael focused her research on emerging adults, ages 18 to 25, and has continued this work at Columbia University's Justice Lab since 2017. And in addition to conducting cutting-edge research and supporting states with systemic reform, she organizes the Emerging Adult Justice Learning Community, a first-of-its-kind, carefully orchestrated collaborative learning environment that brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates from around the country to increase learning and policy innovation in this new field. So, without further ado, Lael Chester.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Avery, for your great introductions. I am going to share my screen for some slides. I direct the Emerging Adult Justice Project at Columbia's Justice Lab, and we do focus explicitly and exclusively on that 18 to 25-year-old population, which can be both in the juvenile system and the adult criminal legal system, right? You could have committed a crime before you're 18 and then be, community supervision and support through probation or potentially residential treatment, some kind of incarceration, loss of liberty in the juvenile system. Sometimes some states that goes all the way up to 25, or you could be 18 exactly or 18 in one day, right? And then end up in the system. This is a burgeoning field. It's just been tremendous growth in the 6 years that I've been working in this field. It's sort of shocking. So it's part of my job is going to be to try to share a little bit of what I see that nationally and where I think trends are going. So just to start off, people may be already familiar with the term emerging adults, but it's this period of transition, right, that everybody goes through. It doesn't matter whether you're in the system or not in the system. It's how do you go from being a dependent child, right? Dependent on financial, emotional support, practical support from somebody, usually it's a parent or a guardian, right? To being fully mature and independent. And there is no magic birthday for that, right? And it takes time, and not days and months, but years for that to happen. So I thought, Brian, we might try our polling question. The first polling question, I would love to ask all of you, when did you start to feel like a grown-up? Was it when you turned the sweet 16th birthday? Was it when you moved away from home? You sort of, had independent living. Was it when you voted, when you got your first beer legally? Was it a sort of meaningful job? Or was it when you actually started paying all your own expenses, like your cell phone? So we'll give it a few minutes, and just curious to see what people think. Votes are still coming. Vote early and often, as they say. Okay. What do you think, Brian? If that's enough time? Give us some more time. So right, the vast majority, the largest vote was 40, I guess not a majority, but 48% said when you move away from home or you leave a family. The next most is you paid your own legal expenses. The next one is meaningful job. Voting, legally buying alcohol, which is 18 and 21, it's just 1%, and turning 16, that's interesting, 5%. So that's sort of very telling in terms of what we view ourselves as becoming adults, and what does the justice system consider us as adults. So when you think of emerging adulthood, there's the sort of the main task in that age range is to figure out, who am I and who do I want to be? Those are big questions of life, but those are the questions that you're really grappling with when you're sort of college age, right? And when I say who do you want to be, that's not just where do you want to work professionally, what your career is, but who exactly is your family? Who's going to be your partner in life? What's your sexual orientation? What is your gender and gender identity? What's your race and ethnicity identity? Who do you belong with? Who are your people? Who are your group? Right? And those are really important questions. And when you're younger, you tend to sort of rely on the people around you to sort of answer some of those questions. But the 18 to 25-year-old, that's your job, is you're coming into your own and you're figuring out those things. There's three main bodies of research that guide this burgeoning field. The first two are neurobiology and developmental psychology. So what's happening in this age range between 18 and 25? Turns out you are very similar to your younger peers that are 16 and 17. You're more more volatile in emotional settings. You're influenced by peers. You're less future oriented. The hallmark of emerging adulthood is risk taking. Risk taking peaks at 19. I think a lot of people think it peaks at 16, but it's actually 19. So that's the hallmark. And for those kinds of characteristics and things that you're dealing with, those become exaggerated if you have a history of trauma or any kind of brain injury. That's not to say that young people aren't super smart, right? And that they're going to beat me at a math test any day in cold cognition. But what happens in development is that the cold cognition and hot cognition do not operate on the same timeline. Hot cognition is when you make decisions in emotionally charged settings. So, right, really relevant to the justice system, that develops much later. So all of these kind of characteristics of your brain development, human psychology, we're talking about full development in your mid-20s. Not 16, not 18, not 21, 25, if not beyond. Again, if you have a history of trauma, probably beyond. Actually, next slide is trauma, right? And I know that there have been some presentations on this before, and for many of you working in the field, this is not going to be news to you, right? But youth in our justice system have a very, very high rates of trauma, and that includes youth as an emerging adults, right? We have this random definition of youth that really makes no sense. So I would say, 18, 19, 20, 21, et cetera, also have a high rate of trauma. And that trauma changes your course, your trajectory in development and transitioning into adulthood. It shapes it and it delays it. And so that, again, so if we think sort of a normal, everything goes right, you sort of finish up developing your brain and development is 25, okay, but you've been in the foster care system, you've bounced around, you've witnessed violence, potentially you've experienced violence, right? That's going to change who you are and how you make these decisions and you transition into adulthood. There's a third body of research, which I think is really important and is often overlooked, especially in the court system. We talk a lot about neurobiology, developmental psychology, because that's the research that was really relied upon to find, for example, death penalty unconstitutional for youth, and questions around life without parole. But sociological research is incredibly important. And what it shows is that when young people reach certain developmental bridges, like milestones, right? So they have meaningful employment, they're in a stable relationship. A lot of the research talks about the language marriage, so you'll see that in the slides. But I think, I'm assuming that is absolutely as relevant to be married. It doesn't have to be a heterosexual relationship. It's that you've committed to somebody and you're giving and you're in that. That helps with maturity. And that when you reach these milestones and bridges, you desist from crime, right? You leave that behind. Some of this normative risk-taking behavior starts to dissipate. And there's a couple other really nice ones, which again, some of these wonderful webinars have talked about, are things like mentoring. Not only that you have a mentor, but that you yourself can be a mentor, right? You can enter into that adult role and be a caregiver, a helper yourself. So this is just a graph we often use, is to think about this bridge, this transition, right, from adolescence to adulthood. And the top and the sort of blue words are sort of these developmental markers. No particular order. You don't have to have an education before family, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the point. It's just that these are the kinds of things that we know help people grow up and desist. And the things below, again, no particular order, but these are the sort of characteristics that are going on while you make this transition. You're a risk taker. You're very influenced by your peers. And so that is kind of part of the overall transition. There is good news. There is great news, which is that the vast majority of young people will age out of crime. They will mature by their mid-20s and they'll leave crime behind them if they're given the opportunity to do so. And that's where I'm going to turn to our justice system. So, right, the juvenile justice system, our youth justice system, right, first created Cook County, 1899, and all the states quickly followed. Every state has a separate youth justice system. And at the time, we didn't have the neurobiological research, right, or necessarily developmental psychology. It was mostly instinct. Like, people had children, they saw youth, they remembered how they grew up, and they thought, a child is not an adult. They're just not a mini adult, and they have to have a separate justice system in order for that to be really fair and effective, right? We could have a separate system. They picked various ages, 16 to 18. There was even a period, which was kind of interesting, in one jurisdiction where there were different ages for the gender, right? The assumption is that some gender sort of grows up earlier than the other. Except for one state, Vermont, 18 is the upper limit for every single juvenile justice system. That's not to say you can't be tried and prosecuted as an adult as under 18. We know that's the case. We've got 3 states that are still 17 is the highest, but then there are all these exceptions. If you're charged with murder, so many states you're automatically tried, maybe even as young as 10 years old, right? But generally speaking, that is the cap. And yet, in so many other ways in society, we're already moving that cap up, right? And some example, we're talking about child welfare. There's very much an understanding now that you turn 18 and you've been bounced around the child welfare system, it's like falling off a cliff. All resources are gone. That makes no sense. My own children are far from independent at 18, let me tell you. My 2 emerging adults and my 1 adolescent. That's just not realistic. We talk about like pediatric guidelines, right? It's pediatric care, healthcare is at least till 21. And they admit, and the association says, that's also 21 is kind of arbitrary. It could be higher. Jurisdiction that legalized marijuana, they're thinking about 21. And then the big one, right? Affordable Care Act. You can stay as a child, you can stay in your parents' health care insurance until 26, right? This understanding that you're not ready to go off that cliff. Healthcare is needed. You're going to be on your parents' plan. But in the adults in our current system, again, except for Vermont right now, you're 18. You are definitely in the adult system. Maybe earlier, but definitely by then. What do we see? We see there's a disproportionate number of emerging adults, right? They're overrepresented more than they should be, right? 10% of the population, but 25% of arrests, 19% of admissions to prison. They have by far the worst recidivism rates. And in fact, I don't know if you can get too much worse than what they have, but they're the worst of any age group. So they're failing the system, and I would argue we're failing them, right? This is not working. Of particular concern are the racial inequities and disparities. This is obviously an issue that deserves an enormous amount of attention. It is finally getting more attention, I think, on the national public radar. But what people often fail to recognize is that emerging adults have the highest racial disparity of any age group. So we have this federal act, the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which requires states to get federal funds to collect data, to track racial disparities in the juvenile system, and to try to address racial disparities, which exist in every juvenile justice system, right? And we stop at 18. And yet the numbers are worse at 18 and 19. Emerging adults really are drivers of mass incarceration. Right. I mean, we have the, the numbers. This is, one example of the United States, just sort of our over reliance of incarceration. Right. But it's important to remember it's youth that are often, unfortunately, the drivers of this. And since we don't sort of break them out sometimes statistically, people don't know that, they don't recognize it, and they're not addressing it. The criminal justice system, right, has an impact on everybody, my age, all ages. But I think one of the key things to remember is that the particularly sort of strong and negative impact it can have on emerging adults is that emerging adults are just trying to get their feet in the ground in the adult world, right? This is their first job, their first housing, maybe outside of home, whatever home they grew up in. They're trying to achieve education, and having a criminal record and all the collateral consequences that flow from that are, again, difficult for all ages, but particularly tough if you haven't even had your first job yet. Right? You haven't put your foot in the door, you haven't gotten started. Not to mention the sort of the trauma of being in an adult system, the trauma and the harms that are caused by adult incarceration. So it's the irony is that the justice system, often in the guise of public safety, right? We're going to protect the public by having these young people in the adult system, and they're going to go through this sort of draconian system. But the research would say, actually, what you're doing is preventing them and interfering with their natural maturation process. right? And if they can't get that first meaningful job, if they can't get that partner in life and those things, we know that's what leads to desistance. And yet the system is interfering with all those key developmental milestones. So that leads to what do we do about it? And what are people doing at it? But before I go there, I was thinking, Brian, we could maybe do polling question number 2. There is, as I talk about this, obviously I've used the word emerging adult, right? We're part of the Emerging Adult Justice Project. So I'm very clear on that. But there's a lot of debate. Should that be the right word? Do we like young adult? Do we like transitional age youth? Do we like emerging adult? Do we like late adolescence, which is the term of art most often used in the court system that I've seen, where the various litigation. What is the right term? And I just love people's thoughts. So it looks like voting is happening. About half people voted, so just give this a little more time. Okay, what do you think, Brian? Should we? Yeah. Okay. So young adult wins 58%, emerging adult the second, transitional age youth behind, and late adolescent is just 2%. So that's very interesting. And I think we maybe could talk about this during the discussion. Is there is something to be said when you're a young person. I think the polling might be somewhat different. I found just informally that when I'm talking to a 22-year-old, they really prefer a young adult to emerging adult, potentially. I find when we're trying to move legislation that polling would show that emerging adult is better, that legislators get the idea that you're emerging, you're not quite, it's a process, and they're more likely to be more open to kind of systemic reforms versus a young adult versus old adult. You're still an adult. It seems more stagnant, but I'd be curious to know how other people feel about that. So we'll see how that goes. So I want to just the really focus on, okay, so we know what emerging adults are. We know what's going on with them. We know that they fare poorly in the justice system. So what are the alternatives? What do we do? And I'm going to share with you what I see nationally and in New York State. I think New York State has lots of examples. But I see it as 2 buckets of activity. There are buckets of what I call practice, where a particular judge or a particular warden, right, can say, I'm going to do something different with emerging adults. So that's more the practice versus the policies, which will come next, which are, that's much more of a legislature and a governor signed off on a bill, right? That's a more systemic reform. And often when we're in, I've noticed in my career with justice reform, you kind of want both, right? You want practice because it's often easier to innovate in smaller chunks, see how it goes, prove that's effective, or tweak it and then prove that's effective, whatever it may be. But you also want the policy because you don't want justice by geography. You don't want it that my child is in this town and the next city over, they get a completely different result, right? That's unfair, fundamentally unfair. And you don't want it so that that particular judge steps down and retires, or that particular warden or that elected DA, and then have all those reforms just disappear, right? Because it's practice. It doesn't have to be there. So that's of concern. But I'm going to focus on practice first. And the first 3 I'm just going to talk about as sort of, and this is a big one for the Justice Lab, right, is that the goal is to invest in the community and to have healthy communities so that young people and their families and neighbors, et cetera, are not, swept into the justice system, right? We want them to be community safety. We want them to do well and flourish. That brings safety. And so you do see now different jurisdictions. I think Washington, D.C. is a good example of saying, we need to really move money or be really thoughtful on the money we have to be targeted in this direction. So that actually could go in the policy side too, right? Because budgetary priorities is sometimes a policy, but I'm putting this kind of at the moment in the practice. Diversion. There's there's not, it's not coverage nationally at all, but in the various states that I'm working in, a lot of district, elected county district attorneys, or in like Vermont, state's attorney, et cetera, they have diversion, a pre-arraignment diversion, which is the gold standard, right? Usually for the juvenile system. They often don't have it for 18 and plus. Again, this magic birthday, even though you might be in high school at 18, and you probably are still in high school at 18, those sort of denied you. And if it is, it's not necessarily developmentally focused, right? It's diversion for all ages, including an 80-year-old. Right, so that's very, very different. But Philadelphia is one DA's office. There are others that have, been very impressed with this, or their thoughtful process in really thinking through diversion for emerging adults and younger youth. Reentry is another one. I give the example in Massachusetts. The probation department is partnered with a group called UTEC, which is a community-based group that works with sort of high-risk youth, a lot of gang-involved youth, who do work both with young people behind the wall and then once they leave either a jail or a prison. And they have those caseworkers, those street workers, working directly with the young people, right, and providing the services from this organization that's all about young people. So that would be an innovation in practice. There are three others, and these are the sort of the bigger ones, really, honestly, that are really emerging, and not to use that word too many times, but we had our project recently published 3 papers on these. So that's why these psychedelic colors that you're going to see, those are the covers of our papers, which you can find on our website. But one is specialized courts. And what this paper does is it talks about the group of people in the learning community, which are researchers, practitioners, and policymakers from around the country. What do they think the key elements of success are for specialized courts? So, and what are the pitfalls, the thing you should be concerned about? And so the 3 kind of classic examples I often give is San Francisco, which started in 2015, North Lawndale, Illinois, which is really interesting because it's a restorative justice court. And then it focuses on emerging adults. It's in the adult section, but a juvenile judge presides, right? So this is like this really cool, innovative, borrowing from lots of interesting, promising, or best practices. And then Brooklyn, New York, also is another really interesting example where they partner with the Center for Court Innovation. And it's targeted specifically for emerging adults. There are other examples, but those are just sort of 3 classic ones. Another one is specialized probation or other caseloads. So in San Francisco, right, they have a young adult court, but what they had started with in San Francisco was specialized probation. They had a department, transitional age youth, TAYS, I think is how they call it. They had a unit that focused specifically on this age group, and then they built the young adult court on top of that, or they added to it, they enhanced that. But that was sort of, I think, the seed, important seed, or more than a seed. It was a plant that they then started to plant next to for a garden for young adults. So you start to see that. An area that is really new is specialized defense. So if I'm in Massachusetts and I'm a private attorney who's going to be appointed by the court, or I'm hired by the state, the public defender's office, if I want to represent young people in juvenile court, I have to have specialized training. I have to be certified, and I have to know adolescent development, et cetera. But when I'm 18, no, I don't. And yet it is as relevant as the practice for the juvenile court. So some states are saying, we're missing the boat here. Maybe we should have a specialized unit, or we should require training and certification. We should be giving support. We need to think about this. So that would be a specialized practice. And then the last practice I'll mention, the questions might come up later, is corrections. Should there be special units or facilities that just have emerging adults? And here's a whole list. But the newest one, as of literally like a week or two when they officially launched, is in Massachusetts again, is in their prison system. So those are for much longer term sentences and is for young fathers. So they, again, just starting. The ones that are been around longer are in Connecticut. The TRUE program is for males. The Worth program is for female facility. There's one called Mountain View in Maine, which I don't think is even listed here. And actually, that used to be a juvenile facility that they renovated and now have emerging adults. So there is a whole practice in that. But let me flip to the policies. Again, the advantages of policies is that hopefully it's harder to undo and everybody is included. And one of the problems with, in sort of my home state of Massachusetts, when juvenile diversion was first surfacing, there was a really wonderful diversion program. It was in a completely white middle upper class community. Lovely, but in a white middle upper class community. It did not impact whatsoever youth of color, youth facing poverty, communities that are being challenged, communities that are heavily policed, right? So it's lovely, but it can actually, play a role in our troubling inequities and racial disparities. So policies, where do I see the trends happening? This is the first one's a really interesting one because it's happened much faster than I ever envisioned, which is, okay, you have to pick a date, an age, right, where you cut off between the juvenile system and the adult system. So you're going to have 3 states that still say 17th birthday, but the rest of the states now say 18, and the world, right, the international standard is at least the bottom line is 18. Does that really make sense? Does that really follow the research? Again, it's arbitrary. So you can have a super mature 18-year-old, you can have an immature 18, but knowing the population, 21 makes a hell of a lot more sense in so many ways. And so if you have a state with a decent juvenile system, you can't do this if your juvenile system is a complete and utter mess, right? Could you start to include some of the emerging adults? Could you have high school age kids? Could you have 18, 19, and 20-year-olds in your juvenile justice system? And I want to say there's also the issue of the juvenile system, the adult system. It's not even just the system itself and the treatment. It's you're adjudicated or you're convicted. And those are really strong distinctions, right? One's individualized, rehabilitation is the goal. The other is deterrence, retribution only. Felony conviction, right? Public record, public proceeding. Those are 2 different worlds. So I just want to remind people like that's what we're getting at. And could you kind of incorporate some of the emerging adults? Vermont said, yeah, we can. They passed a law that says we're going to raise the age to the 20th birthday. That doesn't mean they're not exceptions because there are exceptions for under 18-year-olds. So fortunately, very few. But if you're charged with the most serious crime, you're going to get an adult sentence. But the vast majority of youth do not fall in that category, right? And so they're basically saying, we're going to connect you to youth services. We're going to have youth supervision in the community. We're going to, if we're going to detain you, you may not even be adjudicated in the end, but we're going to do it in the youth system. We're not going to traumatize you and put you in the adult system. And now there are a number of other states that have been considering this, have had legislative hearings and bills. So you see that list. So I think I'm thinking I missed California. So California had a bill. So I think there's 7 other states at play. And I would say within a couple of years, we'll probably see up to at least 15. And I think you're going to see a few more states go Vermont's direction. Another area of policy is these youthful offender laws. It's there's no, unfortunately, good name for it. There's no good, it's basically hybrid systems where you take elements of the juvenile system, elements of the adult system. Sometimes that states serve only under 18 like that, but in other states over 18, like New York has a YO. It's not as robust as it used to be because you've raised the age, but it exists. So Vermont, their YO goes to age 22. So you can have this combination. Another one is just expungement. How relevant is a conviction at 19 when you're 35 and nothing, and you've gone on with your life? Not relevant, right? Research knows this. That's not relevant. Can you be relieved of that collateral consequence? Does it have to follow you for life when you want to get a mortgage and you want to get this and you want to do that and be licensed for some career? No, it shouldn't be, that's holding people back in a way. We want to encourage them. We want to support them. We want them to be able to support themselves, their families, and live a full life in the community. So that's another area you see. And the last one sort of on the deep end, which is thinking about sentencing and resentencing and parole. Again, this is a period of tremendous opportunity and change. Young people are changing all the time. So you're 19, now you're 29. You are not the same person you were when you were 19, right? Enormous growth. We all change all the time. I hope I change in the 10-year period, but I don't change like I did when I was an emerging adult. I mean, sometimes I felt like each month I might be like, who am I going to be this month, right? I was figuring that out. And so you have states saying, okay, let's legitimately look at that. Let's have an early look. Doesn't mean you're going to be resentenced or paroled. Not going to mean you're necessarily released, but we're going to get an early look. We're going to check it out, and we're going to look at it with a developmentally appropriate lens. We're going to look at who you were, what was going on at the time. So that's it. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I think Brian has maybe some questions and maybe questions from the audience. So I'll turn it over to him.
Great. Thank you so much, Lael. So we have another polling question before we get to the next round of the webinar today. So Lael, if you want to ask it, that's totally fine.
Yeah, sure. Brian, you might bring it up for me? Seem to be.
Yeah, so it should be visible to everyone in the audience.
Good.
Question, I'm most excited about emerging adult justice reforms that focus on, and then they can provide what they're most excited about.
Okay. Do other people
see
it? I see it. I see it.
Just wait.
Okay, people are voting away. Thank you for voting, everybody. So much fun to see all the answers. Give it a few more minutes.
I think that's about it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. I forgot about that last one. That's really interesting. So 40% are raise the age, right? Thinking about sort of this, where to delineate the youth justice system. And then 28% specialized courts, then followed by special caseloads, which I know could mean a lot of different things, but that's of interest. Specialized corrections is down at 10% and hybrid systems down at 7%. So that's absolutely fascinating. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, so I don't know, Brian, if you want to kick it off with questions or how you want to do it.
Yeah. So we'll move into our informal conversation portion. I would just encourage everyone who's in the audience, if you have a question for Lael, to put it into the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to it here at the end. So my first question for you, Lael, is you mentioned that having good role models and mentors can help with desistance. And how might we do this for emerging adults? And is it more difficult for youth than for youth under the age of 18?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, it can be done. I don't think it's actually that different from youth under 18. What can be hard is that when you get to the 18, but a lot of folks are sort of disengaged at that point. So under 18, the assumption is you're in school, right? So you have that network, you have a family, even if the state has potentially moved you from your biologic family, right? There's some, right? These things that we couch you in. And when you're 18, it's not as obvious to the outside world, but it is obvious to the 18-year-olds or the emerging adults. They know who they look to and how they're connected. And so a big piece of this is working with the young person, who are those people, and creating opportunities for them to meet more people. So, for that age, it could be a romantic partner, in some ways. It can be a teacher. It should be in a way. It could be a boss. It could be a coach. It could be, an aunt and uncle or a grandparent and then the system itself, right? The sort of movement towards things like credible messengers, right? Having people around that understand sort of how difficult it is to navigate, to be a resource is very important. But young people may not gravitate, one direction or another, which is fine. But the point is that they find their people. We all need people. So my child, I have a 14-year-old and I have a 19-year-old. They both need people. And they need the opportunity to find those people and to build that relationship.
So speaking of desistance, what does desistance typically look like within this line of research and work? What do researchers and practitioners typically mean by desistance? I know it can be sort of a term that not everybody agrees on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I've read a lot of the research. I have not done the hardcore research. So if others on the phone want to disagree with me, please do. But generally speaking, at least the policymakers, when they're talking about desistance, what does the record show? What are the data? What does it show? They're talking about no more criminal involvement in the criminal justice system, right? Is that sort of realistic? No. If you are living in a heavily policed neighborhood, you have been in the system. Could you dip back in just because there's, stop and frisk in your neighborhood? There's this, there's that. Yeah, you can. Does that mean that you haven't desisted? No, not necessarily. I mean, there's some behavior which is normative, right? It's just that if you live in some communities, no one knows about it. In other communities, it becomes a formal sort of criminal complaint and a prosecution. But I think, as young people grow up, they stop taking so many risks. They do think through the future. They are busy building their lives, right? They're busy with family, having children, finding partners, whatever it may be. And that is the ideal thing. I don't think there's one clear path. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes we're like, if you pick up an arrest, that clearly that you're a failure. No, not at all. Not at all. Not all arrests even lead to convictions, right? So, but I think traditionally that's really what it comes down to. Did you stay out of the legal system, or did you dip back in?
So what is the biggest piece of advice you could give to practitioners working with emerging adults? What should they really know, you think?
I think my biggest piece of advice is, what would you want for your own child at that age? What would you want for any? I think you're talking about youth who are still developing. That's the key, and what's developmentally appropriate for that age range. And so, if you're privileged enough to go to college, for example, you have my father told me it gives you 4 more years to grow up, Lael. And it's true. You get 4 years to grow up. I didn't have to even decide a major for 2 years. My major necessarily had no bearing on what I ultimately was going to do. I was in a pro-social setting. Some people have, nice housing. Some of it comes with physical, mental health counseling, right on sort of campus, right? All these opportunities to explore your interests, right? I mean, there's a lot of support and cushioning that happens, but not everyone gets that. And so that's what you're trying to look at is think of the long picture. It's going to take some years. It's not going to be a straight line. There are going to be mistakes, but can we help them make that bridge into adulthood? And what would that look like? And anytime you put on that felony conviction with those lifelong collateral consequences, every time you detain somebody, even if for a day, is for a week, we worry about detention for juveniles under 18. Why are we not worrying about we worry about detention of all ages, but emerging adulthood can be so traumatic. You might be 1 week away from your younger peer. So that's what I would say is you got to just, we just have this, we follow the law, right? Under 18, over 18, under 18, over 18. And I want to challenge that sort of notion and myth that happens.
So what do you think future research examining emerging adults in the justice system should look like? What should we be focusing on?
One thing I would really welcome and love and encourage is outcome evaluations of current innovations. It takes a lot to start up these different innovative models, but we're not going to know much unless we really study it. And I know that there is research happening in San Francisco, for example, the young adult court. But I mean, I would love to have it be specialized parole. I would love to be raise the age. I would love to have specialized corrections. It's great intentions. I think there's no reason to think some of this and a lot of this isn't going to work really well, but maybe not all of it. Are we net widening? Are we cherry picking? Those are concerns, right? Are we exacerbating racial disparities in some way that we're not aware of? And you think about something like specialized corrections, if you had, very robust, meaningful, developmentally appropriate programming behind the wall, but then they're released and there's nothing, and they're homeless, and there's no support, probably a benefit to have them, certainly in terms of conditions of confinement and treating people humanely. That's a plus. But have we have we just completely missing the boat by not extending that framework and that innovation to reentry and to the community? And I think I think we got to study it, and we have to do it. And I don't want to hold people back and say, oh, you shouldn't try until it's been studied. It has to happen simultaneously, but that's what I would love.
Thank you. And so we're going to move into our audience Q&A portion. So the first question, somebody said, youth and young adults with developmental disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal legal system. Are there any states implementing legislation or practices for this group specifically?
I am personally unaware of any state that's doing that. I think that there are practitioners within justice systems, whether it's a judge sitting in a particular court or, defense attorney or probation officer, whatever, right? I think that there are individuals who have this on their radar, but I am unaware of anything more systemic. I think Vermont, because they raised the age, so it's gradually being implemented. I was actually in Vermont yesterday, so it's very fresh in my mind. So the 18-year-olds now, if you're charged with a crime, you're in the youth system. It's a Department for Children and Families and the social workers who work there that are assigned the cases. And they work with youth in the child welfare system, and they're sort of steeped in developmental issues, including any kind of disability, and they have access to resources, and they're used to that. And so I would say that would be like a state that might be ahead of another state where it's very compartmentalized. There's the adult system, there's a juvenile system, and they don't talk to the other branches of government and other services. So I would say that might be kind of the closest I could think of as a model.
Can you say any more about any practice or policy shifts that are specifically responsive to emerging adults who have committed a violent act in their past? It often feels like this group is left out of reform movements.
Yeah, always left out. Violence, guns, even not violent, but gun cases are often left out. There's a great paper that I recommend people read, and I can, it's on our EAJ website. That's about emerging adults and violence. It was written by three members of our learning community that talks about, really kind of how arbitrary it is that somebody, a young person committing a violent offense isn't necessarily more likely to commit another not violent offense, and a young person commit a non-violent offense isn't necessarily going to not commit a violent offense. I mean, they're in this age range where lots of things are happening, and it doesn't sort of, this idea that we can predict, we know the future based on a past events, right, is ridiculous. So, but that's not the politics of it. So if you're an elected official and you're running, you're a district attorney and you're creating a new diversion program for emerging adults, it's going to be really tempting to carve out the violent and the non-violent. I do think Brooklyn has a diversion program for emerging adults with gun possession. It's not necessarily a violent offense, right? But we normally treat that. There is in a Manhattan alternative to incarceration court that we're doing some work with, which has been a wonderful experience, and the Center for Court Innovations involved with that too. And they do have violent cases. I mean, those are felony cases. So it can happen. It happens sometimes because they're sort of somehow that got carved out, but it is the ultimate challenge.
So this young adult, emerging adult age group has overlap with the age range for recruiting police officers. What are the impacts of having system actors who are also emerging adults dealing with emerging adults who are justice involved?
Excellent question. Right. Well, first of all, it sort of can explain sometimes the practices and the incidents that happen with police, right? If they themselves are impulsive and peer influenced, and right, they're going to go, their judgment, not always as mature as it's going to be too. So that's just important to note. Sometimes they have a history of trauma too, so that's interesting to note. And I think it can be hard. I mean, I think for sometimes I know some youth facilities, they don't want a 21-year-old even working in a residential treatment with 17, 18-year-olds, right? That there's just not enough of an age difference, or that they're worried that somehow, that there could be things that leads to sort of more inappropriate stuff. So I think that is a concern. And it speaks to some ways, professionalizing the different arms of the justice system. I know when we went to 2018, went to Germany to look at their system, because they have their upper age of juvenile jurisdiction goes to 21, and all the serious cases stay in the youth system. They don't go in the, it's the exact opposite of us. We're always carving them out, right? The violent offenses, they keep the violent offenses because their view is that's why it should be in the youth system, because it's rehabilitation, right? That's the whole point here. And, their training to work in the facility, kind of like a youth prison type facility, is 2 years. It's like professional training for 2 years. So even if you started at 21, you're not finishing till you're 23. We don't come close to that. And I think there are problems with our approach.
Another question is, what can people do to advocate for more legislative changes to occur in order to decrease criminalization of young adults? And they also note that in California, their county jail system has included a mental health court in which some of their child welfare system involved youth have gone through, but not all qualify. So what can people do to advocate for those legislative changes?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there are organizations and people, for example, in California that have been looking on this. I know Elizabeth Calvin, Human Rights Watch, and Frankie Guzman, I think the Youth Law Center in San Francisco are both, very involved in looking at systemic reforms. It is a challenge. My job is a challenge in so many ways because the youth system, the juvenile justice advocates, some of them, not all of them, say, not part of our mission because we advocate for youth and our state defines youth to 18. So we can't do that. Other groups have said, well, we're not going to be beholden by how the state defines youth. We're going to look at the research and how youth should be defined, right? And then the adult system's hard too, because I think if you are an adult criminal justice advocate, you really want to, at least I feel this way often, you don't want to cherry pick. You don't want to say, I'm working on just this age group and that the 35-year-old and 45 don't deserve reform too. Of course not. So you're trying to think of things that is everybody. So right, expungement could benefit everybody, but there is, without a doubt, the research shows us, has a particular impact on emerging adults because they kind of come into the system and they can't get themselves out and then they cycle in and out. And so I get that, but it's also hard. So a lot of the traditional advocacy organizations that do adult systems are not always so open to this. I think things are changing, and I think the point is to get them to change, right? To educate people and say, I want to help. What can we do? Let's do it together. How can I support you?
Great. Lael, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YGI and everyone in attendance for sharing this amazing work with us. But before I get to the closing announcements, do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
I'm just very honored to be part of this. And I think you have, the folks listening in, you are very experienced, very knowledgeable. And I guess my parting thought is, we don't want to be dictated by the justice system, right? The confines of how it's happened. We would never create this. If we had a blank slate, I don't think any of us would create the current system we have for youth or for any age. And so we have to think outside the box. We've got to be proactive. And, and I'm just supporting you all the way. I'd love to be helpful if I can. And I just encourage you to just keep an open mind and think about what is a youth. What are they going through? How do we support them? Whether they're dipping in the child welfare system, whether they're dipping in the criminal justice system, we should not be hurting their maturation process. We should not prevent them to become healthy adults. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I close, I do just have a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. So the next session of our Lunch and Learn series will be on August 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be hosting Dr. Keith Cruz, Professor of Psychology at Fordham University. He will be discussing trauma-informed practices and the probation process. So be on the lookout for registration information for this upcoming webinar session. The YGI also has an ongoing podcast series called Let's Talk About Youth Justice. The inaugural episode features a conversation with Dr. Timothy McCuddy, who spoke with me about traditional bullying, cyberbullying, and issues related to both. And we will be putting the link for that podcast episode in the chat momentarily. And we've been in the process of producing new episodes for the series this summer, so be on the lookout for new content for us. From June 1st through the 3rd this summer, the Youth Justice Institute was honored to convene a 3-day virtual forum titled Beyond 2020, The Next Normal COVID-19 in Youth. The forum brought together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to assess the system and community level adaptations implemented during the pandemic and to explore potential next steps that can ensure that the youth justice field emerging out of the pandemic is more just, equitable, and wellness oriented than what youth and families experienced before 2020. The recordings of the keynotes and panels are now available on our YouTube channel, and we will be putting the link to those videos in the chat momentarily as well. Shortly after we finish here, we'll be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete this survey as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. The information will be used to improve future webinar sessions, and the survey should take no longer than 5 minutes. We will also be putting the link for that survey in the chat as well. And finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Lael has presented today. We also look forward to seeing you at future YGI events and webinars. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.